So the Wales Centre for Public Policy, which is where I am from, the centre that I work within, we work to support decision makers in Wales to access, understand and use the best available evidence for the issues that they're grappling with. And IPPO does a similar task, but working with policymakers not just in Wales, but across the UK, and has a partnership with evidence review experts within the UCL, but also within INGSA, which has a kind of international evidence scan remit and role. And so what we are trying to do within WCPP naturally complements what the IPPO is trying to do. So it made sense for us to start working with our colleagues in this way. We wanted to use, so we have UCL colleagues visiting today to try and facilitate conversations with policymakers that we're already in touch with within WCPP, so that IPPO is able to respond to what's happening in Wales and the kind of issues as they are seen through the Welsh lens. But we thought it was a great opportunity, given that we have our colleagues here, to talk about this issue which we framed this event around. So we're, one of the questions we're often asked as WCPP colleagues, as WCPP, so not just me, but also my colleagues, is about this tension with working with within the political environment to support decision makers who are pursuing a political agenda, while also maintaining its focus on providing support that are rooted in academic evidence and rigorous independent evidence. And how do you navigate that tension? So we want to talk about various things that fall out of navigating that tension together with this panel. So I will briefly introduce the panel in a minute, and then I've got some prompts for a discussion, but we're also interested in questions from the audience. So just to briefly, as I say, introduce colleagues. So we have Professor Sir Geoff Mulgan, who's a professor of collective intelligence, public policy and social innovation at UCL. For those of you who haven't tracked his career, he was previously Chief Executive of Nesta, CEO of the Young Foundation, Director of the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and co-founder and Director of Demos. Sarah Chayter is the Director of Strategy and Policy at UCL. Sarah is co-chair of UPenn, the University Policy Engagement Network, and co-investigator at CAPE, which is Capabilities in Academic Policy Engagement, as well as being the Strategic Engagement Director at IPPO. I'm Dan Bristow. I'm Director of Policy and Practice at WCPP. And next to me, I have my colleague, Steve Martin, who's the Director at WCPP, while also being the Professor of Public Policy and Management at Cardiff Business School. And then finally, we have Jonathan Breckon, who's the Visiting Senior Research Fellow at King's College London. He was the Director of the Young Alliance for Useful Evidence and has been instrumental in a wide range of initiatives to champion smarter use of research and evidence. He's co-editor of a new book, What Work Centres, Lessons and Insights from an Evidence Movement, which is published as of now.
Last Friday.
Yep. Last Friday, congratulations. And also you have a role at Post, which I think we might talk about as part of this discussion. So, to kick us off, as I've alluded to, the model that WCPP and IPPO are pursuing in terms of trying to get evidence use is demand-led. So we're trying to understand the challenges being faced and then design projects that respond to that. And of course, as part of that, we're assuming that policymakers do want evidence or need it. Some argue, and some even challenge us by saying there's a risk in that. You get captured, that you get asked to produce evidence just to meet existing predetermined political positions on an issue. Jonathan, I was going to come to you first, because obviously within your role at Post, you come into contact with lots of different policymakers and politicians, and you must have to try and navigate that challenge. I'm interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I mean, in terms of, as you put it, navigating the tension, your first point was about, do they need evidence? And that's certainly something that you need to be really brutal about, in that a lot of times absolutely don't need awkward social science telling you what you should and shouldn't be doing. And I personally find it quite easy to kind of drink the Kool-Aid and believe, like, obviously this is going to be the solution to everything. And certainly my recent work in Parliament through the Parliamentary Office on Science and Technology, which is also UCL led, I should say, it really was a sort of reality check of evidence means something very specific, i.e. a particular kind of legalistic evidence, not an academic evidence. So the question then comes, how much do you become a proselytizer to make the case for even the value of facts and data and science and social science, and not just assume it? And how, if you are proselytizing, how do you have some degree of balance? Is that just impossible? And I think that's something I'm struggling with. I think the best way is not trying to sort of make an argument for the value of research evidence, but really rather just show rather than tell. And here's the value in itself. And a lot of the time it's a quite relational thing. You might need to be that person making the case. That was a mistake I made, certainly in the parliamentary work, was assuming that the evidence would talk to itself. I needed to get my pass in Parliament. It took me about a year, but it was worth it to try and do that sort of sensitive, subtle proselytizing for even the value of it, why it would add value. You also mentioned, Dan, the capture. That's quite a good dilemma to have, isn't it? To be captured. I don't know how often that happens. Is there a particular bias? I do quite a lot with the police at the moment, and certainly something like the Metropolitan Police. There's a lot of challenging issues there, and I probably am a little bit biased because I speak to people who are interested in social science and the best of us. How do I manage that? I don't know. I don't know what an easy way is. Certainly, academic social scientists will keep you honest and tell you what the problems are. I would also say look beyond the centre of power, whether it's here in Cardiff, and look at those street level bureaucrats, the people who have more devolved power. That's a much more interesting conversation, challenging, but a much more interesting one.
I wanted to add to that. I think it's really interesting. I think it's important not to see it all as one way, in that there's the risk of researchers or research evidence being captured by policymakers, but equally there is arguably a risk that policy priorities can be captured by the research agenda. So I think navigating that tension is probably about fundamentally recognising that politicians set policy priorities because they're democratically elected, but researchers set research agendas because they are best placed to do so, and that's the system we have, and it's, as you will all know, embedded in our research funding system. So actually, I think managing the tension needs to start from just recognising those two different points. And then, of course, all the magic happens in the messy bit in the middle, which is where a lot of us are all working. So it's how you bring those two agendas together. And I suppose, I agree with Jonathan that you do have to be very pragmatic on one level. There's just no point, standing and shouting from the rooftops about your research that totally contradicts whatever the sort of the policy desire of the day is. That said, I think there is a middle ground where you can understand the ultimate policy outcome, but you can find, even willing politicians and certainly willing officials and civil servants that will want to know what the evidence is for achieving that outcome, what some of the nuances, and that's probably where you have to go in. I think certainly a lot of earlier career researchers who initially approach me in my role at UCL for support, they've kind of got this idea in their head. This is a gross generalisation, so I should apologise to them all before I say it, but an idea in their head that, what they need to do is effect policy change and effect legislation, and they need to do it now. And I think that's just, that is 20 years down the line if it's ever going to happen. Actually, where you start is the conversation about the messiness. And that all starts, as Steve and Dan know, with how you build and manage the relationships and establish trust.
Thank you. I want to talk a bit more about the messiness and what happens in that space. Steve, do you want to?
I just say I agree with all of them. I think it's helpful to think, why would policymaker want evidence, and to acknowledge that they have some pretty good reasons, actually, if they've had prior contact with elements of the academic community. So these are gross generalizations, but the idea that we take 2 years to say anything, and that when we say it, it's so caveated that it's naive, that it's not context specific enough. You can have some sympathy with those. Years and years ago, I did some interviews around this stuff, and it's a very tasteless phrase. But a minister said to me, the problem with you lot is you're always going around bayoneting the dead. I mean, well, we've moved on, and a study which you started 3 years ago because you thought we might be interested in it is of no use to us anymore whatsoever. So I think that as researchers or knowledge mobilizers, knowledge brokers, we need to see it through the policymakers' eyes as well. And we need to be prepared to prove the value of evidence. So we've had more demand for what we can do in WCPP than we can possibly ever meet. But we've had variable demand from different parts of government, different ministers, different officials. And with those ministers that are more sceptical, I think you need to be kind of really on your mettle to produce a timely, relevant, helpful, uncaveated piece of work which doesn't bore on about your methodology, but focuses on what usefulness to them out of this piece of evidence is. Warsaw, very early on in the time that Dan and I were doing this role, we were asked to do some work for a minister. Be a bit careful. I got the preeminent professor in this country, anyway in the UK, on the issue, to come from Cambridge, having written an evidence review for the minister. Prepped the professor, very confident of their ability. I'd talked with them before. I didn't all of this as neutrals and walked in, introduced them, and the minister said, "Well, I don't think we've got any use for this, have we?" Brushing aside his evidence review that was on their desk. And we spent about an hour, luckily very engaged professor, able to take, and after an hour of discussing it, I said, well, let us just talk you through the report. At the end of the hour, which had overrun the half hour, which we'd been given, this is slightly creepy, the minister took me by the hand and said, really very useful. So do you think we have to go on a journey which both washes some of the myths about academics, irrelevant, really interested in their own agenda, likely to mouth off to the media, caveat 20 years to say anything useful, and demonstrate the value of what we can do? And so I have some sympathy with why would I want evidence. And then something which Dan spotted very early on, and Sarah, you've alluded to, is we need to be subtle about different kinds of evidence. So you might not want evidence about what works, because you've already decided what you're going to do as a policymaker, but you might value evidence about how to get what you want done, implemented, and that's a different kind of question. So very early on in our scoping process now, we try and ask ourselves, is this a what's going on, is there a problem, and whose problem is it, and where is it type question, or is it a what could I do about this question, this problem, or is it what have other people done about it, or is it if I do this, what might happen, or is it I've already decided to do this, how can I make it happen? So I think you might not want evidence which tells you what to do, but you might want evidence that tells you how you might do it, or how you might not do it.
Just one very quick addition, because I agree with everything that's been said. I think it's sometimes useful to think of three quite different audiences. There will actually be about 10 or 12 or 100 different audiences we lump together with policymakers. So there's the world of politicians. Politicians live within their own kind of logic world. It's about elections, it's about opinion polls, it's about party dynamics and so on. They have very limited bandwidth. They're usually very instrumental about evidence, what's useful for me now, which may be a policy, it may be about how, it may be about not misspending money, not being, et cetera, but limited bandwidth. And so, as you say, a 50-page document which buries its conclusion is completely useless. There's a second, though, group, which is the bureaucracy, which could be, in the Welsh government or in a local authority, which is quite different from the politicians. They'll be around much longer. They have much longer timescales. They live in a world of programs and laws and implementation and sort of an orderly, rational world, which in some ways finds it easier to absorb certain kinds of evidence if they fit. And then there's the third group, the professions. And in fact, most of the evidence stuff in Jonathan's book, for example, is about influencing teachers or police officers or doctors and nurses, who are quite different again, very strong, ethos of autonomy, self-control, often rather contemptuous of politicians and bureaucrats, and so on. And I think it's always important to disaggregate those audiences because they have quite different cultures of knowledge, different, so I mean, the medical profession has always, not least always, certainly for several decades, made a lot of use of evidence. Other ones hardly at all. But they tend to have much longer time scale. So in a sense, the key to being demand-led is understanding the culture of the demand is real context rather than trying to be too generic. It's a statement of bleeding obvious, I know.
No, but it's one that it's a trap that you can easily fall into, I think. And one of the things that we've had to, even though it is a statement of bleeding obvious, we've had to learn over time is how do you do a piece of work that starts with one audience and then try and mobilize and make it relevant to other audiences as you go? Or how do you kind of think about those audiences, separate them out while doing a similar piece of work? Different means. I wanted to come back to this point about the kind of the messiness of the space that that sits between rigorous independent academic processes where you can set your own research agenda and then the world of kind of politics and political decision making. And that space in between, I mean, I think, Sarah, I wanted to come to you on this because I think there's a question about what capacity, what capability do you need to exist in that space? And I know that CAPE is deliberately kind of thinking about this, but it's a very different skill set to one that, the skill set that allows you to generate high quality academic outputs is very different from the skill set that allows you to think about or gives you the skills that you need to think about the social and political environment in which that research output might be landing. And there's an open question in the moment, I think, about the extent to which academics can or should be trying to step into that space, or whether it's a wholly different skill set where actually you need brokering organisations like ours to kind of sit in that space and act as the bridge between those two. So I don't know if you've got reflections on
That's
that.
really interesting. I mean, you may have sort of said what I was about to say, which is it points
Sorry.
to the importance, of intermediary organisations. But actually, I suppose the other thing is the skill set is both about the academic community, but it's about the policy community as well. And one totally sort of anecdotal reflection I would make, having observed the last few years and the sort of the evidence for policy agenda rapidly becoming more and more appealing and less of a really nerdy niche concern for about 5 people, which is certainly what it felt like 5-10 years ago, is that there's now an awful lot of incentives, at least on the university and the academic side. They're not perfect, and I'm not saying that there isn't a long way to go, but I think there are probably more incentives on balance now for researchers who are interested in developing some of these skills and spending some of their time in this area than there are on the policy side. And I think that's a problem because if you don't have the same incentives and the sort of the permission, I suppose, to build the capacity and build the capabilities on the policy side, then we are inherently starting from an uneven position. And you can be, the best academic with the best knowledge mobilization skills in the world. And if there isn't somebody or somewhere for you to engage with on the policy side, it's not going to make much difference. So again, it's a bit of an obvious point, but I think it's really important when we're thinking about capabilities and skill sets and capacity to recognize it really is about a two-way flow. I mean, my view is we should be encouraging any academic who wants to do this and supporting and equipping any academic who wants to do this to do it. So that's not the same as saying it's automatically part of the academic endeavour, but I think it's, utterly crucial, almost a moral obligation actually to make sure that those people that want to use their expertise and the evidence that they are discovering to inform public policy to address social problems, why wouldn't we do that? It's actually, when you put it in those terms, it's bonkers to me that, that's not been part of our funding and incentive systems for much longer. That being said, I think it is a particular skill set. And I think certainly at the moment, the role of intermediary organisations is both really fundamental and really still undervalued and overlooked. I often think of us as providing a sort of invisible infrastructure because it's not sort of necessarily recognised in any application for a research grant. It's certainly not recognised in the sort of the development of policy in an official, formal way. But I suppose what having intermediaries and knowledge mobiliser roles does is provide a little bit of space to navigate some of that messiness, that complexity, because probably what you really need is to be comfortable with ambiguity. You need to be really comfortable, I think, with not being an expert all the time. I used to have a boss who did a lot of work to build kind of culture of cross-disciplinary working at UCL, and he always said it started with getting people being comfortable to admit their ignorance and admit what they didn't know, and moving from that sense of I'm an expert on this policy area, I'm an expert on this particular area of research, to actually I may not have all the answers, but I quite like to talk to you and work them out together. Again, it's really easy to say, and it's completely anathema with how we, I think, recruit and reward both academics and civil servants. You know, we don't sort of respect the need for that ambiguity and that need to admit ignorance. So in some way, that's probably the most fundamental skill set, is to have that humility and willingness to talk to other people and accept they will know more about different things.
Yeah, and I think for us internally, recognizing that our skill is sitting in that space more than subject specialism.
So
Kind of look both ways. That's our skill, and that's our. Did others want to pick up on any from that?
Can I ask Sarah a question?
Like
So,
this is going.
So for some of those sort of tacit skills in that messiness, or what Steve was saying in terms of how you went on that journey with that minister, can you build those skills about how you go about it, make it a bit more open? Because I think we've probably got lots of skills that we kind of know, but it's very implicit. And I wonder if we need to make it more explicit, particularly if we want to be more inclusive and bring in people who haven't done it like for 20 years. And yeah, you're
I
nodding.
completely agree. I feel a little bit like Jonathan just set me up there to plug.
I know, it was a genuine question. I don't know if it is travel.
So yes, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, because when you look at a lot of certainly sort of university policy engagement skills training, it sort of does all the right things on paper, but I'm not sure it really gets at that tacit knowledge that you're talking about, which probably comes from experience. So I think it's a little bit about both. Actually. I think it's a little bit, are there formal skills and can we understand what they are for academics? It's a little bit, how do we just encourage people to gain the experience? And I don't know if you remember, Jonathan, but in a previous life of yours, you did a pilot of a training scheme at UCL for academics on how to engage with policymakers. And the single biggest piece of feedback afterwards was, it was all great, but now what do I do with it? What are you, as my university, going to do to provide opportunities for me to use this? So I think we really have to remember the practical usage. And then I suppose on the other side, what CAPE is focused on is trying to understand what are the kind of the mechanisms and the processes and the routes that knowledge mobilisers as a whole can use, and what seems to be most effective. So that's the other thing I think we really influence. It's the what works question. So we are, this is my plug, we are putting more and more on our website about that. But I think it's you know, the value of conversations like this is actually it's about a whole different intermediary organisations. One of the questions I think we're increasingly confronting through IPPO is, it's not just about identifying what are the topic, subject-specific policy questions we can address, but it's understanding the context in which they're being asked, policy system in which they're going to be addressed and implemented. So pulling together some of that knowledge as well.
Yeah, and being able to codify. I mean, we're starting to try and do more and more of this in terms of codifying our own practice and what are the things that we're looking for and why. But Geoff, did you want to come in on this as well?
Well, just one way of sort of thinking about the messiness, and it's kind of a question for anyone as an individual as well as an institution, is where you want to sit on two continuums. So the first continuum is humility to arrogance. So, you know, there are many fields of social science which in the past have been a bit arrogant and then were humble. So economics is a great example. 2006, the economist said, we basically solved macroeconomics. Then the crash happens, you know, and you have to rethink. And there's very few fields where we can really say the evidence says you should do X. It's always more ambiguous than that. So you therefore do need some humility, and the politicians and bureaucrats won't like you if you're arrogant. But if you're so humble and say, look, we really don't know anything, then why should they bother spending time with you? So you've got to navigate your space between those two poles. And the other one is closeness and distance. And you sort of alluded to this on the police, Jonathan. again, there is one school of thought which says any engagement with power is corrupting. It can't help but be corrupting because the state and big business and so on are essentially venal and evil. And if you spend time with them, it will rub off on you. And I know many academics who really take that view quite strongly and try and avoid any engagement with sort of problem solving, compromise, dirty, messy politics. But of course, if you become too close, and if you sympathize, empathize too much with the worldview from being a minister or a bureaucrat, that's problematic too. And this is a constant issue in the literature on all of this, is people either becoming too co-opted, too close, and losing that critical distance, but on the other hand, becoming so dismissive of power that they become irrelevant. And as I say, I think this is almost a personal dilemma, probably for half the people in this room, to which there is no simple answer, because it is inherently messy, and the answers will change in different political contexts. How you feel about cooperating with different agencies, ministries, administration, and so on is bound to change over time.
Thank you, Steve. And I want to ask another question.
I'll try and be brief. I just wanted to add to that, and the humility arrogance spectrum is an interesting one. I think Paul Kearney has a phrase about it's all just about not being an arse. There's a lot of truth in that, I think, and part of not being an arse is not to overreach ourselves and imagine that we have all the answers, or that we'll provide the evidence and that will automatically be adopted into policy. We're one relatively small part of what you've just called an evidence ecosystem, with lots of other players who bring stuff to the table. So I think it's really important to remember that. And secondly, we're increasingly, I think, finding another statement of the obvious, which has taken us a number of years to discover. There are one or two towering figures who can answer the question, but for the most part, it requires a community of evidence providers to come together and talk through the different snippets of insight and evidence and expertise which they bring. So round tables where experts get together and share and pool their intelligence or their evidence, argue with each other if necessary, bringing officials into that discussion so they can say, well, okay, but in our context, what about X, Y, Z? So our work is increasingly co-produced, not just by us with experts, but by among groups of experts, some of whom might understand Wales, some of whom have never understood Wales and can't pronounce cates and all of that stuff, which we can help with. So I do think it needs to be a collaborative endeavour, and it needs to be a process of co-production by different actors within a policy system, of which academics are only one.
And I'd just add to that. I think that one of the things that we've seen over almost a decade of doing this is that one of the things that we can do as a broker intermediary is play a convening role, and that's actually as valuable as a really well-designed evidence synthesis or getting a really good expert into a conversation with policymakers. Actually bringing together different groups who are interested in a particular issue and facilitating that conversation and interaction is incredibly valuable. Geoff, I wanted to come back to this. You kind of set up this polarity between kind of the humility versus arrogance, and as part of that, this kind of sense of ambiguity and working in a space of ambiguity, and how comfortable are you in that space? I mean, I think this is a particularly uncertain time. We just came from a conversation with some colleagues in Welsh Government who are describing a world in which moving much beyond just dealing with the next immediate crisis is really challenging and difficult. And I think linked to that, there's a set of questions and issues facing society for which looking backwards or looking to peers and looking for evidence of what works isn't going to cut it, because there's just too many. It's too fast moving. It's too uncertain. Too complex. And so I'm interested in your reflections on that, and how it's almost like an existential challenge for evidence intermediaries. If there's little or no useful evidence, or if there's no evidence to be, what role can we play? And so how evidence can contribute to decision making in that kind of environment.
Yeah, so when I've thought for quite a while, much as I love evidence and data and observing, we're an observatory, there is a problem, because that by definition is of the present and the past. And what do we do if we're in, as you say, fast-changing field where there is no evidence? I mean, a very good current example is regulating AI or GPT-4. By definition, no one's ever done it. So how could there be any evidence? Or what would a net zero economy really look like if it was fully mature? And I've, for a while, thought there is a problem actually in academia worldwide, that the capacity to do rigorous, imaginative, long-term thinking has been squeezed out. There's many, many reasons for it, which we haven't got time to go into, but it's become much harder for the people with really deep knowledge of a field to do work 20, 30 years out. Now, Wales obviously is in a great position with future generation, that commissioner, etc. And I think this is a potential space of for Spark, obviously, but for the next 10 or 20 years, how to combine the best of, as I say, deep knowledge of how an economy runs or a care system or democracy with the creative ability to imagine future possibilities and try and document that and articulate it and interrogate it using methods from other fields, from the arts, from design, from literature, and so on. So we feed our shared imagination. And going back to AI, about 7 or 8 years ago, I worked on a regulator for AI, which in fact was created. The UK sort of did a semi one, which no one even noticed. But what was really striking is there was literally no option. No one had worked on those options, even though it was obvious even then this was going to be one of the great issues of the next 10 or 20 years. So I think we need some academic time to be devoted to doing this. And as I see it, having really sort of threefold sort of mission. One is to be creative and imaginative and really push the boundaries and escape from the constraints of the present, but to then combine it with what the evidence says. So you want your imagination to actually fit with what we do know. If it doesn't at all, it's probably complete fiction. And also logical coherence, so that then ideally you can experiment and try things out in the real world rather than just having paper blueprints. That's a very summary description of what I think is the crucial future role of exploratory social science, which doesn't have any place or any funding yet in the UK, unfortunately.
No, pretty interesting. Sarah.
I just add a couple of observations to that. So one is, I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember the UK Government Office for Science's Foresight programme. But that effectively used to provide a bit of policy pull, I suppose, to try and get academics in particular to think about those long 20, 30, 50-year time horizons. And I would just observe that it's interesting that that programme was axed around the same time as there was a much greater and welcome emphasis in the Government Office for Science in particular on building sort of present capability. So I just think that's interesting. It may be completely unrelated, or it maybe suggests that the thinking is too much focused on capabilities for now. And then the other thing I suppose I was reflecting as Geoff was talking, that what you're describing probably also needs some cultural change in terms of our policy systems. It probably needs much greater transparency about the ways in which we use or don't use evidence and are willing to discuss that. It probably requires a lot more emphasis on evaluation, so you can do those real world experiments and actually learn from them that we don't have at the moment. And I think it also probably requires a bit of a different approach to how we treat political U-turns. You know, they're often leapt on as some evidence of government being in trouble. But actually, you know, I've always thought that Keynes had it right when he talked about, you know, changing his mind when the facts change. And I don't understand actually why we can't have a system in which a U-turn, when properly explained, is seen as a good thing, because it's responding to the facts of the evidence.
I want to pick up on that, but I also want to put space for people to ask questions from the audience. If I just have a show of hands if people are sat on a question that they want to ask, and if nobody has a question straight away, I'll pick up on that and ask a question of the panel from that.
Or a disagreement.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone's being too shy. Okay, Chris. Well, hang on, because we need a microphone. So, Sarah, a colleague. Yeah, they have. Yeah. We're ready to tweet it out. So Chris, yeah, do you want to introduce yourself? I think everyone probably knows you already, but then ask your question.
Yeah, so Chris Taylor, academic director here in Spark. I've got a question of the panel, because it's about the role of argument, which not really has been emphasised very much. It's about how do we construct the argument for whatever purpose it is, whatever the context is, and what are the skills required in order to do that effectively. And I don't think we give that much attention. I'm just interested to know whether you think how critical that is or not to our work as academics.
Say a bit more about when you say construct the argument.
So, like the way you construct, if you're trying to influence change, you've got to try and persuade. It's a case of persuasion, and it links back to the bit about arrogance and humility, distance and closeness. But through that is the way you construct that argument, that warrant that you might use. And of course that changes depending on how much evidence you've got, how much knowledge you have, how confident you might feel about something, without kind of giving away that you don't know anything, because that's that point. You don't want to say that. That's a dangerous place to go to too. And I just don't think, few people have written about warrants, but not very many. And I'm just interested to know whether anybody's picked up on anything that's useful.
So there's two meanings of argument, and I thought you were going to. So there's argument in terms of a narrative or a framing. And if you want to have any influence, certainly on politics, the framing and the narrative matters as much as the evidence. Some of you may have read the brilliant book, I think 30 years ago, in economics by, she became Deirdre McCloskey, was actually male when the book was written, about how all the most influential economic arguments of the previous century was their rhetorical structure was decisive to them winning adherence, not their logic. And we're humans, we work through narrative. So it's very important, I think, for academics to see the evidence on that and to think of the narrative framing, the why, as well as the what. But there's another side of argument, which we were actually talking about on the way here, which I will mention. So there's pretty strong evidence in education that kids learn better through arguing about things. And through being told, you have to argue for position X, you have to argue for position Y, and then through that that process, things are embedded more. I think that's true of all of us and adults as well. And there's a whole science of meeting design, which I'm very nerdily obsessed with in the collective intelligence field, which often shows how meetings work better if you actually have different roles. So you've got to be the enthusiast, you're the skeptic, you'll take it further, blah, blah, blah. So you get multiple roles which structure an argument, and then in a much faster, can much more quickly actually tease out really the intelligence of a group. These methods are hardly used in academia or politics or business or indeed anywhere else. And I actually had an event with a group of head teachers a couple of weeks ago where I actually threw this at them. I said, there's all this evidence on argument for secondary school kids. Why do you not use any of it? And they then had an argument about it, which was quite good. But I think in almost any of our fields, I'm very struck. Academia is meant to be driven by argument, critical argument. That's what peer review is meant to be. And I'm surprised how few moments we have where it's okay without ego to really disagree and really challenge someone. We've become often, I think, too polite. And actually, including in our engagement with power, probably should be more comfortable with a bit of, let's say, abrasive argument, but with the ego left at the door.
Sake in that space, but yeah, did anybody want to pick up on?
Just briefly and a bit more prosaically, maybe, but in terms of thinking about some of the practical skill sets and capabilities as well, I think the word you just, or the phrase you just used, Dan, safe space, is really important. And it links to Steve's earlier point actually about the value of round tables. Because those sorts of events which are about enabling dialogue, I think, but also I think crucially about providing a sort of safe space to test different ideas and test new thinking and have those arguments. That all seems to me to be really critical if we want to improve the approaches you're talking about. But we've been doing a little bit of work, not through IPPO, through CAPE, looking at how do you establish the conditions, I suppose, for a more collaborative approach, an approach with more emphasis on co-production. And it does mean things like humility. It does mean that whoever's chairing or organising the meeting needs to consciously think about that. It doesn't just happen. And maybe that's the mistake we make. We assume it will just happen. And similarly, I think we assume, got to sort of a research finding that's compelling, that by itself should be enough, but it doesn't tell its own story. I think you're dead right. We have to learn how to tell those stories. We probably have to get away from the idea that you just need the one pillar stat and that's enough. because it's not how politicians talk. It's not how policymakers increasingly work either. It is about the stories. So I think there's a very sort of practical and prosaic aspect to what you're talking about as well, which is how do we provide mechanisms and opportunities for people to engage in ways which are more about narrative storytelling, and how do we build, actually the skills to do it? Because again, gross generalization, but I'm really surprised by the number of phenomenally much cleverer than me academics, who just can't write in a way that is remotely comprehensible.
Yeah.
And how valuable my ability to just write something in a proper structure, which I think is basic, can be to those really, really clever people.
Yeah. War stories, and colleagues within the centre could share a few on that topic. Jonathan, you looked poised to come in.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought out that argument, because it does seem something we can get better at. But maybe again, it goes back to the making tacit skills more explicit. Geoff, this is our conversation on the train, so we're going to repeat some of the something called the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia Universities gets into the minutiae of actually how you do that, and it's not always intuitive exactly how you go about it, but there is a whole evidence base about how you do it that would work in your private interactions with your family, let alone with politicians and others. And things like motivated interviewing, is that what it's called? And that's been going for decades as a way of trying to persuade, but without haranguing. Being on that spectrum, there's a degree of being a little bit humble, but also pushing for things. And it's been used really well from children's social care to dealing with people who are skeptical of vaccinations. I haven't seen any big tests with politicians, but that would be a good one. But I think you need to get into some of those details, even some of the languages to help open things up, like saying, could we debate that? Rather than going straight into it, would it be all right if I could start playing that role? But you have to pick your moment. And I just think we can get into almost the details of how you get that right. But it seems crucial.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chris. I think we've got time for one more question, so I'm looking to see if anybody in the audience wants.
Or an argument. Go on.
Yeah.
Challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So go on.
I was going to throw, there's a famous little anecdote of Lyndon Johnson, if any of you've read Robert Caro's vast biography of him, in which a group of lobbyists go in to persuade him of something. They give him lots of evidence, lots of good arguments, good framing, and he at the end of the meeting says, I'm completely convinced by everything you say. Now go out there and make it impossible for me not to act on it. And so it's something we haven't talked about, but there's always an environment, and a media environment which politicians are responding to. So you don't just have to persuade them, you have to make the environment shift so that they do what they may want to do anyway. And I think people often miss that. Even quite a powerful, he was president of the United States, exists in an ecosystem. And so often it's maybe more important to focus on the media or civil society or some other route to influence than just directly head on. Always think in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
But I think, can I jump in? Sorry.
Well, this is the thing I was hoping to ask a question about. So we've neatly segued there. So go on.
Well, I was going to say, I don't disagree with that, Geoff, but there is a I think that actually takes us back to your question at the beginning, because once you start to think about it, and I think the media engagement and the sort of the way to sway public opinion, of course, it's really important if you want to change policy. But it takes us back to that question actually of, is it what most researchers should be aspiring to do, to change policy, to affect policy change? And yes, so that is what some people will want to do. But that's quite different, I think, from just trying to promote the use of evidence in policy. And I think you can do both. They are both entirely legitimate actions for academics, but I think you need to be really clear about when you're doing them and what your role is, because one inevitably is more of a sort of values-based judgment as much as it's an evidence-informed activity. That was the only thing.
Yeah,
we definitely grappled with that. At which point are we tipping over from being an evidence broker to being just another campaigning organisation? But not doing that means that we're constraining the line of sight between anything we do and a positive change. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, in doing work for decision makers, how do you how do you sufficiently understand the environment that they're operating in so that you can support them to think about what their front of house position is? Because there's going to be all sorts of complexity that there isn't really space for in public debate. But if you're in that conversation, you know, I wouldn't, if I was asked to go and change the environment so that it made it impossible to do that, I would struggle with that. So I don't see that as being my role. But I can help decision makers to think about how, who else might they be trying to mobilize? How might they try and mobilize them? And how can they navigate the kind of front of house versus, the kind of the detail and complexity and nuance that will sit behind. And this comes back to this question about, what do you consider to be evidence, or how does academic evidence sit alongside other sources of evidence, and how do you bring those together and synthesize those in a way that support decision makers to make more evidence-based decisions that are conscious of the environment in which they're operating, more conscious than they'll only ever see a slice of it. All of us only ever see a slice of the system that we're operating in. But how can you expose them to the wider system in a way that it, maybe encourages them to be brave?
I won't name the report, but we had a WCPP report said, for goodness sake, Minister, do not do this. They'd asked us to look into how to do it. Press release from Welsh Government, WCPP report says this, but the Minister says, wherever I go on the doorstep, people want this from me. Guess which option they took. And that's just the nature of our role, I think, rather than trying to sway public opinion.
I mean, we used to use the one-liner, politicians have every right to ignore the evidence because often it is wrong, or because the public may deeply want something, which actually the evidence questions, but they've got no right to be ignorant of it. So the process you described seems to be quite a healthy democratic process. They see the evidence, they weigh it up, and they decide not to act on it. That's fine. That's democracy, to my mind.
Absolutely.
Great.
Do you think there's a chance we could bring in lived experience that triangulates with your evidence as a way of bringing a bit more of a sort of lobbying power without distorting it? I was just conscious there was some work in Parliament on I think it was children in care, and one of the big children's charities, probably something like NSPCC, had got a dozen lived experiences, even brought the kids into Parliament, and that was side by side by something with longitudinal research from Closer that had done weeks and weeks of research analysing data, and of course, which did the select committee go with? They went with the NSPCC work. But I do wonder if lived experience was complementing our research, is that acceptable as a kind of way to tap into the wider? Because otherwise we're just always going to be defeated. And I know we had that event, the Senedd said, there's lived experience and then there's research, but they're not overlapping. Is there some sort of overlap possible, or is it?
So I'm going to jump in here and try and chair this. Sorry. So no, it's fine. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we're not going to be able to do justice to that question. But it's a really important one, and actually one that within the centre we've part of, ESRC are funding a fellowship to look at exactly that. So how can lived experience evidence be used by intermediary organisations like us when we're trying to marshal academic evidence in support of decision makers. But to give you an example from our own portfolio, we've found that doing work up front to engage with people who are directly experiencing the issue that we're interested in looking at is a really powerful complement to engaging with other stakeholders, politicians, officials, third sector bodies in a space, because we found through doing that one of the ways in which I'm being vague deliberately, but it was a massive kind of societal challenge. There's lots of different ways of understanding that challenge. Actually, by engaging people with lived experience, we got a wholly different dimension to that challenge that didn't come through from the other ways of thinking about it. So, yeah, people were saying you should look at this, 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 and this, and actually by engaging with people with lived experience, a wholly different field came through, and so that's one of the things that has inspired us to try and do more work in this policy fellow that we're hoping to recruit in the coming period will help us to do that. But it's 12:15 exactly, so we need to stop. I just would encourage you to show your appreciation for the panel in Norway. So thank you very much.